Well, let's start with the very basic questions here, and that is, and I know this is an awkward question, but can you tell me your date of birth?
Oh my goodness.
Yes. I don't like asking women that question, but
March 23rd, 1943.
and Bill,
March 23rd, 1938.
really, you share a birthday, huh?
We do.
Okay, how about that? And where did you both grow up?
I grew up in Schuyler, Nebraska, and have been a pure Nebraska person all my life. When Bill and I married, we moved many, many places.
I was born in Chicago, Illinois, and after I went to work for the railroad, I got moved around, and then ended up in Nebraska for my last assignment, and that's where I met Judy, and we got married.
Well, let's go back and talk about upbringing, education, school. Where did you go to school? High school? Anything beyond that?
I went to Chicago Vocational High School in Chicago, and then attended the University of Illinois at Navy Pier, which was also in Chicago.
And I graduated from Schuyler, Nebraska, attended Midland College, which that was at the time, it wasn't a university, and took various classes at different facilities after we were married.
Favorite subjects?
Well, I've always kind of always been interested in railroading. Started out with a toy train set. Mom and Dad always had trains, and so where I grew up, I was right on the Illinois Central commuter line in Chicago, and so it was on an elevated structure about half a block from our house.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then their big freight terminal was about 2 blocks from our house, where they worked on locomotives and refurbished cars and equipment. So, as a kid, that was always intriguing, and every once in a while the workers would let you come inside and see what was going on. So that kind of caught my eye early on.
I know the South Side's quite a railroad hub.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what steered you to vocational tech school, or did you have an option to go there?
That was an option. The Fenger High School was our local high school on the south side, and Chicago Vocational was the other. But what interested me, when I was in 8th grade, I took drafting, and so I got into kind of industrial design and drafting, and Chicago Vocational. I met the professor that taught the drafting classes, and kind of liked him very well. He was very, very congenial and very helpful, and so that was one of the reasons why I swayed and went over to the vocational high school.
As far as Navy Pier, that's I did not know that was a
Yeah,
school.
yeah.
Except
one
for
time,
the Navy.
Yeah, one time that the university taught classes there, so they had both wings where they taught classes at one time. So
How'd you get down there to take the bus?
Streetcar.
Streetcar. Okay. Okay.
yeah, I did a lot of streetcar riding in Chicago. So
And Judy,
I just really took the basics in college. I didn't have anything that I was really, really interested in. A lot of maybe physical therapy, and that was kind of my first goal. But then I ended up in real estate.
okay, great. So you get your University of Illinois degree at Navy Pier. How did you get into the railroad field?
Well, a very good friend of mine that I was going to college with, his grandmother was a vice president at the Illinois Central. And so when I needed a job, she suggested that she could help me get a job. And so she got me the interview with Chicago Northwestern. And that's how I came to get hired on the Chicago Northwestern. Was she got my foot in the door to get an interview, and from my own interview, I got hired. So
Were your parents in the railroad? What did they do?
no, Mom was a school teacher. She taught home economics at Gallisto School on the far east side of Chicago, which is right close to the Indiana border. And my dad worked downtown. He was an auditor for Shell Oil Company.
How did they take your entry into the railroad field?
They were supportive.
And did you have siblings as well?
Well,
Any brothers and sisters?
I have one sister, and she's in New York.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you joined Chicago Northwestern. How does did you learn on the job? Was there training involved, tech school related to that? How does that work?
Well, part of it's on-job training, and then part of it you took courses. Actually, I took some courses, of course, at the University of Illinois, but I also took some side courses through International Correspondence School, ICS, and they had some railroad engineering courses that I took on the side, which helped me with the railroad. So the railroad recognized those courses through the ICS.
So back to engineering, you decided to go the railroad route rather than civil engineering or any of the other kind of engineering backgrounds. Huh?
Yeah. Of course, in the railroad, you get a little bit of all engineering, especially in our engineering departments, because you're exposed to like electrical engineering, civil engineering, mechanical engineering. So you get a broad spectrum of problems that you end up having to solve. So.
Did you have any mentors or people at Chicago Northwestern that kind of showed you the ropes?
Oh yeah, I think you always everything you do, you always find somebody. For example, when I first started out in the doing the drafting as a side job, I had a mentor by the name of Roy Young, and he was very instrumental in teaching industrial and railroad engineering and drafting. So,
how much of when it comes down to what you did was behind a desk versus in the field in those early years?
in the early years, I was probably more out in the field. So I would say probably 60-70% was spent out in the field, and the remainder was spent in the office, making sure the paperwork was done. You always had paperwork to do. You never got away from it. So
There's always paperwork, yeah, no matter what. So was it mostly because it was Chicago Northwestern, kind of in the greater Chicagoland area, or did they send you to the far nether regions of Lake County, or?
well, I started out kind of in the downtown area in the commuter district, and the Chicago Northwestern has 3 major lines out of Chicago, so you had plenty of experience on, because each line was a little bit different, served different communities, and you ran into different zoning laws and regulations that you had to follow. So consequently, Chicago's a good learning area.
Probably a lot more strict than Wyoming or Montana.
Yeah, very much so.
So you started at Chicago Northwestern in 1957, is that correct?
Late 56, early 57, yeah.
Okay. And you were there through the early 70s?
Yeah, 1974,
Okay.
I went to the Union Pacific.
Why did you decide to make the jump?
Be
I know
honest.
you've mentioned this to me,
Yeah.
so
No, yeah. No, I got fired from the Chicago Northwestern, and and what they did was, they didn't tell you that, but they fired you for 30 days. And so at the end of 30 days, they offered me a job back. And so I thought, well, if they're going to fire me again, I better go looking. So that's when I started looking around. And we had the AREMA convention, which is the American Engineering Railway Association, had their convention in Chicago. And so in one of the hospitality suites one night, I was introduced to Robert Brown, and he was head of the engineering department for Union Pacific. And so consequently, he said, started asking me questions of why I got fired. And he said, "Kid, we don't fire people on our railroad for what you did. We promote them." Well, that solved it. And so I went to work for the Union
Wow.
Pacific.
So you were a free agent.
Yeah, I was free agent.
Can I ask what you did?
Well, I took a cut in pay to come over to the Union Pacific, and within a year and a half, I was making more money than I was making on the Chicago Northwestern, and doing engineering work. Even though I was out in the field a lot, it was more enjoyable and a more friendly atmosphere.
So you weren't opposed to leaving Chicago Northwestern?
Best thing I ever did.
Well, but what he asked was, what did you do to get fired?
Oh,
Oh.
That you would get promoted at Union
Yeah.
Pacific, but
well, they said we were manipulating the maintenance away work that needed to be done, and in reality, the Chicago Northwestern had let the track deteriorate so much that I had some gangs working, actually big construction gangs, doing track maintenance work, and so we were told to give them their 5-day notice. It was in first of November, thereabouts, and so what they really wanted you to do, the union's employees had to get a 5-day notice in order to lay them off, and so I gave them their 5-day notice, but instead of letting them just leave and go home, I put them to work for that 5 days and went down on the Southern Illinois line, which had a lot of slow orders in it, and we took off about 10 or 12 slow orders. And so consequently, when we had a general manager, and when he found out that I didn't let the gangs go home, I made them work and eliminated all these slow orders. Why, he took exception to that and said, "You're fired." So R.M. Brown at the UP said, "Kid, we don't fire people for what you do, we promote them." That's how I came to work for R.M. Brown. They called him Rocky Mountain Brown, R.M. Brown.
I imagine it sounds like, especially in the 1970s there, that the railroad industry was fairly volatile between unions and between the changing nature of railroads in the 70s. Mergers were taking place.
Yeah, there was a lot of mergers and a lot of railroads, going under, and railroad like the Rock Island went down, and then finally Milwaukee went down, and so consequently there was a lot of changes in the whole railroad industry. It was very volatile, you might say.
All those old names were falling to the wayside. But tell me about being you make the jump to Union Pacific. Tell me about being the new guy here. Even though you're bringing with, at this point, what 15 plus years of experience, Union Pacific is a much larger company.
Right. So there was probably some resentment for me coming over, especially when I got promoted after being here a very short time, and you got promoted over people that had been here longer than I had. So I had to overcome that, but it's something you deal with and you put behind you real quick. So
tell me a little bit more about Rocky Mountain Brown, because you just don't get a nickname like that for nothing.
Well, he was he'd been on the railroad for many years, and he'd worked all over the West in various capacities all the way up, and he got that nickname, of course, when he worked out in Oregon and Wyoming on the Union Pacific, and he was a tough, gruff gentleman.
Yes.
But, so I got along with him very well. I mean, if a lot of people were afraid to talk up to him because he was so gruff with them, but if he asked a question, I answered it. Some of them he didn't like, and some of them he checked out and found out I was correct, and we got along just fine.
Might I add, the reason why they got along just fine, because they both had the same disposition and personality and reputation. Seriously.
So what's the railroad industry as a whole at this time? What's the general disposition of it working in that? Is it a lot of tough? I mean, I waver back and forth between white collar sort of, and then guys out in the field, gangs moving and fixing tracks. And so what is the overall disposition?
Well, it's kind of funny. When I worked for the Chicago Northwestern, the extra gangs that we had that worked out and maintained the railroad and stuff, they would go down and have Generella, which is a commissary company in Chicago area. They hired people off of Skid Row in Chicago. So you had some winos and that, and so that was one learning experience for a young man like myself, who had a mother as a school teacher, and to learn the ropes there, and find out their hiding places, and they'd be out working, and all of a sudden they'd sneak a drink somewhere, and you'd find out where they hid their bottle and got rid of it. But and you had to discipline them in such a way. So when I came over from the Chicago Northwestern, UP, it was a different atmosphere. The people over here were very tight-lipped and didn't want to explain a lot of things to you because they figured you might learn more than they knew, and that made it tough that way. So you had different things to overcome in growing up, and you grow up fast. So
It sounds a bit of both worlds, a bit of hard drinking sort of guys, and then also a bit of corporate world, working your way up the ladder. In a lot
yeah,
of ways.
because I didn't explain, but on the Union Pacific, for their extra gang people, they hired Navajo Indians off the reservation, and of course there was some good ones and some bad ones, and I got along very well with the Navajos. If you treat people like you like to be treated, why it worked very well. And they just wanted some respect. You gave them respect, and they would help you weed out the bad ones on them that they had brought up from the reservation. So they would point them out, and pretty soon you'd get rid of those. Always got rid of the bad apples. So
Well, and then also the Union Pacific at that time was a very family-oriented company, and they would hire from the families a lot of your siblings or aunts and uncles and everybody. So at that time, again, compared to some of the other organizations, being a family, close-knit company meant a lot to all those people.
Imagine, yeah, it becomes quite the extended family, holiday parties, get to know and help each
Yes.
other.
yeah, and that was, I had to overcome that because I was an outsider that came into this family atmosphere and wasn't welcome right off the bat.
You married into it. So tell me about the different titles you held up to this point, into your entry into Union Pacific.
Yeah, on the Chicago Northwestern, of course, I started out as in the drafting department, so I had different jobs in the drafting department, from junior draftsman to senior draftsman. And then when I went out in the field, you had surveying jobs, like a rodman, an instrument man, and an assistant engineer. And then the next step would be non-union. So you would go either assistant division engineer or division engineer. Which,
Is that a pretty big jump to go union to non-union?
Money-wise, yeah, it was, because in order to have good people, I think they paid a little more for the non-union. You know, they had to, and to keep good people, take the good people out of the union. So consequently, that happened.
Okay.
Then,
Your positions at UP?
yeah, then at UP, I had various jobs. They hired me as a draftsman, and then I soon found out that I wanted to go back out in the field, so some field jobs came open. So then I went back out in the field as an instrument man, assistant engineer, and division engineer, and then became assistant division engineer, assistant division manager, and consequently ended up in a top job.
So walk me through a day in the life of the top job. What's that like?
Well, it all depends. If you were here in Omaha, you'd start out with a morning meeting, and early in the morning, and then conference call generally, and then from there you would find out what the gangs were doing out in the field, what the injuries were overnight, were there any injuries, if so, what were they? I always went through injuries every day. Hopefully you didn't have a fatality, which they did it, and when I first started out, there were fatalities, and consequently, safety became our primary concern. So, safety was always number one in my mind on the railroad. And if you did a safe job, you did a good job. If you didn't do a safe job, why, consequently, you would get low marks. And as I graded people later on in life, their safety was always the number one thing that I talked about first in evaluating people.
So what else would the day entail?
Well, yeah, once you went through the morning meeting early in the morning, then you find out where the gangs were. You might go visit some of the gangs. Depends, I traveled a lot because the gangs were stationary. Pretty much in the early days, we had outfit cars where the gangs lived in the bunk cars, and we had a kitchen car, and you had cooks out there that fed them 3 meals a day. They always had a sack lunch for out on the field that they would bring out, that the cooks would prepare and bring out, and you always had sandwiches and fruit or something like that in there. So that was pretty much the end of the day. You'd make sure all the men got back to the bunk cars in a safe, efficient manner. We had buses that transported all of the gang members back and forth from the outfit cars to wherever the gang was working. So,
How many men or gangs were you in charge of?
well, when you start out, you usually just had one. Later on in life, we probably had probably a dozen or so big gangs working around. When I ended up in the top engineering job, you had 3 divisions and you had gangs in all 3. 3 areas. So you had gangs on each one of those big areas, and consequently you would go around and visit all of them. I tried to hit all the gangs so that you got to know the Indians that we hired from the reservation. I knew quite a few of them, so over the years.
But what was interesting, he didn't let the gangs know he was coming. So there would be, Wimmer's here, and then they'd all really straighten up. But yeah, he would never let them know ahead of time.
The unannounced visit
That's
from the general.
right. That's right.
So between that, keeping them on their toes, and you mentioned railroad safety, tell me a little bit more about railroad safety, because I imagine that has changed a lot over the years, and it sounds like it was really important to you.
Yeah, we in the engineering department probably preach safety much more than the operating department or the mechanical department did at that time. Although the mechanical department had a fairly good safety record. When they had an accident, it was usually a big deal. But we, as we went along, then we started co-joining. In other words, we put operating people, mechanical people, and engineering people together to go audit the different facilities, so that you had a representative from each of the major departments looking at safety and asking questions, which in my mind really helped, rather than the straight line, just the engineering looking at safety or the operating looking at safety or the mechanical looking at safety. Because once we did that, we brought safety down to almost zero. And that was the ultimate goal, is to bring the injuries and the fatality. We had a lot of fatalities. There was one year, I think we had 10 fatalities in the engineering department. And so we brought it down to zero. We brought the injuries way down, not to zero, but as close as we could get it down. And I think all of the preaching we did on safety paid big dividends.
I imagine, yeah. So, Chicago Northwestern, you're in Chicago, Union Pacific. Where do you make the move to?
To Omaha.
To Omaha. But I know you've been other places as well. So walk me through that timeline.
Well, Chicago, I went up, I worked out of Waukegan, I worked out of Belvedere, Illinois, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, worked out of there, Clinton, Iowa, worked out of there. Then I moved out and moved to after I worked out of Omaha in Northwestern, but then after I moved here, of course, then I
Kansas.
Yeah, spent time in Kansas City a couple times, Cheyenne,
Portland,
Portland, yes,
Salt Lake City,
Salt Lake City.
Okay.
and back to Omaha.
So all over. And at what point did you meet, this is where Judy comes into the story, what point did you meet Judy?
It was in 1981, and I was employed at Union Pacific at the time, and I also was in management, and I was a traveling purchasing agent, which we had one in Pocatello, Portland, Salt Lake City, Cheyenne, and Omaha. So when one of those would go on vacation or be sick, I would go fill in for them. And my boss said one day, you're going to Cheyenne and you're going to confront Mr. Wimmer. And trust me, he had a reputation. Nobody wanted to deal with Mr. Wimmer. And I said, what am I going to do? And they said, you're going to prove his people are abusing field purchase order books. So the first meeting, I went and sat with my boss in front of his desk, and his eyes just glared, and I went, oh, this is not going to be fun. And told him why I was there, and then within a couple, 3 days, we had to sit down and go through these field purchase order books to prove that they actually were abusing them. And consequently, that is how we met, and that was in January. And I did not like anything about the man, and we were married in July. So it all turned around. Yes, it was a very interesting situation, wasn't it? Yes. Yeah.
So how'd the purchase order books check out?
Oh, they were abusing them.
Okay.
Yes, they were abusing them. Yes, yes. And I proved it. So, yes, that was interesting.
And they got straightened out.
It's good you had the help on that. Imagine if you didn't.
Yeah.
Things might have been very different. So, since you were working at Union Pacific, and how did you get into that? I think I heard that your parents were involved in the railroad.
Oh, my father was with Union Pacific 51 years. I was born, I'm not a military brat, I'm a railroad brat, and I was born and raised into it. My father was section foreman in Schuyler, Nebraska, and being in that capacity, the railroad furnished what they called a section house, a home for him at no cost. Now, mind you, it wasn't that much of a home, but there was no rent, there was nothing. So that's how I grew up in the railroad. My brother, my cousins, my uncles, my whole family was railroad. And I was presently in management, and when we got transferred to Cheyenne, they told me, you're going to have to make a decision between you and Mr. Wimmer. One of you is going to have to go, because at that time it was not nepotism, but what's the term that they used at that time? Something of, I can't remember exactly what the term was, but anyway, we both couldn't be in management. Well, my job wasn't going to go where his was, so I went back into the union. And when we were in Cheyenne, I put on my steel-toed boots, my hard hat, and they had a scrap line out there, and I worked right alongside all the other employees, throwing nuts and bolts and tie plates, and that is my job, yeah. So, and then when we got transferred to Portland, my seniority did not carry in the union. I didn't have enough seniority, so that's when I got out of the railroad. Working,
yeah. I imagine the railroad, the stereotype, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the railroad is largely a male-dominated business.
Mm-hmm.
So what was that like, being in a small minority, perhaps?
Well, again, when I started in management, that they were promoting women at that time. But then when I had to go back into the union, and I'm working beside these men throwing these tie plates, and I had to get on the donkey car and drive it on the rails and do things that all the men were doing. And they were all going, well, this is Wimmer's wife. What do we do? And I said, you just treat me like everyone else, which they did. Got along fine. It kind of was embarrassing at first, but then you bite the bullet and
Till
you do
they
your job.
let a cut of cars hit you. She was running the trackmobile one day, and the switcher let a cut of cars roll down the track that was supposed to be locked out, and it wasn't. And the cars rolled into the trackmobile. And I told her I think it was about time we did something different.
Yeah,
Wow, that's going back to safety.
that's exactly
pretty,
right.
How'd you come out of that?
Well, he preached to me always when they put me on the donkey car. He preached to me, never jump if you get rear-ended or hit or something. Never jump out of the donkey mobile or the little engine. And I could just hear the gentleman behind me that was going to hit me. He went, jump, 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 and I just went, no, I didn't. And fortunately, the train didn't derail. I stayed on, and everything worked out fine. But it was scary, and it's like, okay, I need to do something else.
That's quite a brush with
It was.
death.
Yes, it
almost,
was. Yes.
So you at that point decide, I'm going to pursue something a little safer, and Bill is going to stick with it. And that was where in the U.S.?
Cheyenne.
Cheyenne, okay. Because I know you spent a lot of time in Wyoming
Yeah.
and you know, the middle of nowhere up there. I think I've seen a photo here where you're in a parade. Your kids are in a parade.
Well, Frontier Days.
Frontier Days.
Cheyenne Frontier Days always had parades once a year, big parades, you know, and they would do it 3 times in a week or so.
3 parades.
3 parades, and through the downtown area. They go from the downtown area, fairgrounds to downtown and back. So consequently, that was a big hit.
Well, you were Grand Marshal of the parade, and the railroad participated big time in the Frontier Days. They had that little train that children rode on all the time. They had that, and then they would bring a buffalo and he built a pen, had his men build a big pen in one of the shops to store buffalo and take this buffalo through the parade all the time. And he'd get the buffalo loaded. Well, then the Humane Society kind of got into it and going, nah, you can't be doing this. And so we had to quit doing it after a while. But yeah, it was
So
it was
the
fun.
buffalo ended up in the there at the
Shop, roundhouse.
well, because the reason the Humane Society got into it is between the parades there was always a day in between the parades, and so I would leave the buffalo in the cage. We fed it, but I would hide it in the shop building so that people weren't coming and looking for it, you know. And the Humane Society didn't like the idea that we kept them in the shop, and that even though we fed it and watered it and cleaned it and everything else, they didn't like that idea. So consequently, that was the end of that. But it ended up back out at the zoo. So
Sounds like a town where you need to make your own fun out
yeah,
there.
Very
High adventure.
yeah.
So you're married at this point. What
Yes.
year? This is July
81.
81. And you have 3 children?
4.
4 children. I'm leaving somebody off. I've met 3 of them.
Yes.
What is it like raising a family in the railroad field? That's for both of you.
Yeah, I'll let her start.
Well, okay, so we moved to Cheyenne, so the kids were there like a year and a half, and then he came home and said, we're going to Portland. So we went to Portland, and the kids went to school in a little town called Sherwood, Oregon, and got established in sports and that. And a year and a half later, he comes home and says, we're going to Salt Lake City. So we went to Salt Lake City, but instead of living in Salt Lake, we found a home up in Park City. And that was one of our best stopping points because they don't have snow days there. They have one day a month that you show up at school and you get free skiing all day long. So they did skiing and they did snowmobiling and all of that. And when he came home and said, we're going to Nebraska, they're going, where are we going to ski in Nebraska? So, yeah, it was very good for them. It made them all very outgoing, and they're all very successful in their capacity of their employment now. And they made friends everywhere they went. So it really was good for them. At the time, they didn't think so, but now they're very happy that that happened for them.
I think at the time you didn't think it was going to work either.
I didn't either.
So you're back in Nebraska. This is now it's the senior part of your career, really, here. And I think you have it actually over there. 2007, you were awarded the Railroader of the Year. How does one get that award? What is that like? I imagine it's only given to one person per year, and you're it.
Yeah. And I don't remember how I got nominated. Do you remember?
Oh, they have a committee, and they nominate one person from each railroad that they feel have excelled in their positions, and what he had done with the railroad, and that is why he received that honor that year. And it was a big honor. Yes, very much so.
It had to do with how you dealt with people and how you maintained your railroad, did the railroad have a lot of derailments caused by track problems and anything to do with that? So consequently, I think we'd gone from probably the worst maintained railroad in the country at that time to probably the best, and I think that's how I ended up getting elected.
I saw the ceremony was at the Union Club in Chicago, which is
You-
quite a high-end, swanky place. So this must have been quite an honor.
Yeah, and you had engineering department people from all the railroads all over the country,
And suppliers.
and suppliers, and some foreign country suppliers that we dealt with.
The
Yeah,
Japanese, yes.
yeah,
Okay.
because we dealt with the Austrians a lot, and the Germans, and the Japanese, and of course, I've made good friends with all of them. So.
And since you brought up the Japanese, I know you have a couple pieces here. Tell me about working with outside the United States, what that's like, making friends and acquaintances, dealing with the time change.
Yeah, time change is a big problem. You become very cognizant of what time it is over there, so that when you talk to people over there, we deal with their time instead of our time. So, because when they come over here, it's quite a difference in time. So, usually takes them a day to get acclimated if they come into the States. So, I made trips over there to look at the production lines and talk to employees, and everywhere that I had traveled overseas, we always had like a town hall with the employees, and of course used interpreters because most employees didn't always speak English, and some of them spoke very broken English, so you use interpreters. And but it was always I always enjoyed going to the foreign countries and explaining things that we did, and they could ask any and all questions, and they did, and it was good.
How does the railroad differ in Asia and Europe than it does to the United States?
Basically, the basic railroad is the same all over the world. Uh, it's how it's applied might be a little bit different. Some of the rules and regulations are a little bit different by country, but basically it's the same no matter where you go. The gauge, as you know, you got different gauges throughout the world, but maintaining the railroad is pretty much the same. So you all speak the same language, only different languages. So.
Did you go with on any of these trips?
Oh, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Many, yes. We traveled. In fact, there was one trip that we went around the world in 21 days. It was, we hit a lot of different countries with the different railroads, yes.
What was the most interesting place you visited?
Yeah.
Well, the place I liked best was France. The place I didn't appreciate the most was probably India.
Interesting train history there. Yeah.
Yes, and just a very. I mean, of course, every place is a different culture, but that probably was the most difficult, I think, that we went to.
I
But
imagine, yeah.
we went many places and friends all over the world.
So when did you retire? Do you recall?
October 1st, 2008.
Was retirement tough? Was it a challenge? I mean, here you've been in the railroad business since the late 50s.
Yeah. Well, it's in your blood, you might say. And, you know, you never really retire because people still call me today and ask questions about what we did 10 or 15 years ago. Do you remember when we did this? What was the reason we did that? And why did we do that? And then you start racking your brain and go back and answer the questions. So, no, it's still enjoyable, and I still enjoy talking railroad.
And that's why he has this museum. That was his release point in building this museum and getting him into retirement. Because there was a rule the day he retired. It was because he traveled our entire married life all the time and never home. I said, okay, the number one rule is you will leave at 9 in the morning. I will send you a lunch, and you can't come home before 6. And you can't imagine how many railroad wives went, why didn't you tell that sooner? Because he wants to know what's for lunch or what's for breakfast or what's for dinner or what are we going to do. And when you set down the rules, and so that's how this whole museum has developed. And it worked very well, very well.
There's plenty I can see around to keep you occupied here. So you mentioned railroad being in your blood. I know one of your sons, Todd, works for the railroad. What do you think is in store for the future of railroading for him and beyond?
Well, you know, it's still the most economical way of hauling long distance freight. Trucks are good for short distance, but over the road, you know, you get those double headers going out west. You can still haul more freight in a shorter amount of time on a rail car than you can on trucks. You know, certain commodities, we do certain intermodal on the railroad where you can take trailers on and off, or containers. Containers mostly come from overseas. They come by ship and they're easily handled at the ports, and then they can double stack them and move them in. Like, you get a lot of goods coming from Asia and the Orient, and then you'll get stuff from different types of commodities come out of Europe to the East Coast. So I think that I think most of the downsizing that we've seen over the years is kind of at a standstill right now, and railroads are pretty much status quo. Yeah, you might see some of the short lines merge into another railroad, or a couple of short lines moving together. I'm on the board of a short line company, and we have half a dozen little shoreline railroads that we've picked up over the years. And they're profitable, for what they do, serve industries. But I don't think you'll ever see them going back to a major railroad. They're always something for the little guy to do, just like the big ones. So,
How would you say the railroad in your time, 50, you told me earlier,
51.
51 years, I knew it was over 50. How did it evolve, between computers and digital and personnel? How did it change?
oh yeah, drastic. Before you had computers, you had accountants. They called them that went around. We had accountants in the gangs, for example. We'd have 2 or 3 people that, that somebody took roll call in the morning and at noon and at night, and then you had accountants that took care of the payrolls that were assigned to the gang. So you had one car that probably had a half a dozen people that worked for the accounting department that would, keep record of different things. If you had a bill, like if you had a facility that was used by another railroad, those are called joint facilities, and consequently, the auditors would keep track of what was done in minute detail because you billed the other railroad, and the auditors on the other railroad come back and want you to prove it. So that's the reason you had the auditors on the gangs with you. So I think over time, everything's been cut back, and of course, once computers came along, it really simplified everything and made it more streamlined, and consequently, that's why you got fewer people in the railroad today. Is technology has changed, and for the better for railroads. Technology really helped the railroads.
Probably made it safer.
Oh,
Human
yeah.
error was
Oh, yeah.
avoided. Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt.
I know people are always, we've got a caboose at the museum, and people are always disappointed that they don't run those anymore. I know you have at least one, possibly 2 trains or train cars, rolling stock, named after you. Tell me a little bit about that. I know you have a model of one over there too.
That was when you retired and they named
Oh.
the inspection.
There's
Yeah,
the William E.
yeah.
Wimmer.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
that's-
floating around the United States.
Yeah, that travels the country. That's a track geometry car, and what they do is they can check basically 6 different parameters of the track. You can get right and left alignments. You get grades, whether the track's level or out of level, out of cross level. So there's and consequently, major 6 different measurements that you take, and it constantly goes over the railroad. And that car runs, except for it's down probably 2 weeks a year for maintenance, but otherwise it's usually running pretty much 7 days a week. And then the guys they'll rotate. You'll have one crew that runs it for a while, and then they get their 7 days off, and then the other crew will run it. So what they constantly run it around the railroad to ensure the quality of the track structure is there. Of course, then you've got other type of crews that are out inspecting. You got bridge inspectors that check the bridges, really whether they're underneath bridges, see whether the streams are scouring the piling or the abutments, and what type of maintenance needs to be on. So you got the track people, the bridge people, and
So another thing that was named after him is called the Wimmer Y,
Okay.
which is about 24th Street and Interstate 80. What he developed was the track was coming from the west, and he divided it and made a Wimmer Y, is what they call it. And what was that for?
well, that was after the merger of where you put 2 railroads together. Then downtown, there was no way, we used to have to, if you came up along the track out here, which was Missouri Pacific, if you came into town, in order to go west, like to North Platte, you had to run over to Council Bluffs, run the unit around the train, take the units from one end to the other to go to North Platte. And so downtown, I went down there one day and stood up on the viaduct there and figured out how we could build a Y down there. And so we bought the property and built the Y. And of course, the train crews, once they started using it, the guys that were on the construction train crews when I was building it started calling it the Wimmer Y. Well, after it was put in full service, it stayed the Wimmer Y.
So you have the Wimmer Y, the William E. Wimmer, which is that the only type of its kind that's out there?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So
And then there's the Wimmer Special, right?
Well, no.
No?
What the Wimmer Special was, every time he would do an inspection with his employees and take probably 10, 12 people out, and they'd be out anywhere for up to 2 weeks going over the territory. And so there was one locomotive that he loved, and it was the 3975.
6936.
Oh, I had it wrong. Okay, 6936. And it was one of the largest locomotives, and he liked it because it could pull the big train and all that. But the train people despised that locomotive very much so.
It had 6 axle
Wow.
Yeah,
trucks.
that's the Wimmer Special,
Okay.
and that's
so
the
that was the Admiral's flagship,
Yes,
basically.
yes.
Yeah,
and
it was a rough riding locomotive. Train crews didn't, the head train crew didn't like it because it was rough riding, but it was a good track inspector because it found the rough spots, and I could ride the head end of that, and if we hit a rough spot, I'd write it down and send the guys the next day to go fix it. So, but,
And when he retired, they said, that's going in your front yard. And I went, no, it's not going in my front yard.
So looking back on your career, were there any special projects or incidents that you're proud that stand out as you being proud of? I know you've got a couple derailments on the wall, but I'm sure there's other aspects too.
No, I mean, he's just very content with his whole career and very
Okay.
happy and very satisfied. And you'll notice his initials are WEW. And what they employees did was, okay, WEW, work every weekend, Wimmer. And that's what another nickname that he had, because that's what he intended, work every weekend. So yeah, but
Yeah.
overall, I think he's very content and happy with everything. He accomplished a lot in his career.
So retirement was certainly a change of pace. Obviously, there's here, but I know you're on the board of R.J. Corman and Operation Lifesaver.
Chicago Northwestern,
Northwestern,
for
okay,
Historical
okay.
Society.
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah.
So you've kept busy in a number of activities.
Yeah, and I've kept a lot of contacts with railroad people by doing that.
So this whole thing gets started, but I imagine this collection is decades in work in progress. How did this come to be? Because I know you told me a short story about how you acquired various pieces throughout your career. So why don't you share that?
Well, yeah, I didn't start out wanting to collect anything, I don't think, when I was first. But when I first started out, as we tore down buildings, I was on a crew tearing stuff down. And you'd be surprised what you find in the walls and in some of the tool houses and stuff like that. Not only tools, but the china. You'd find, I think all that china you see in the china cabinet over there, I found all single pieces. There was no set of china. anywhere. But you'd find a piece here and a piece there, a piece somewhere else. And so consequently, I started, instead of trashing it, some of the museums refused to take a single piece,
Wow.
so I started saving them. And I thought, well, this is crazy, why won't they take them, you know? So consequently, as you'll see, I have quite a collection of china that, you know, you won't find anywhere.
Well, what I might add, he'd always bring something home, or some of the employees that would find something that was at a facility being torn down, they gave to him. And this was ending up in our homes, each home we went to. And it finally got to the point, our last home in Omaha, I went down the stairs to go to the lower level, and I went, I can't do this anymore, because every inch of wall was covered with what's covered here. I went, something's got to change. So it went into storage. We probably had 8 climate-controlled storage units. That's how much he had. And then when we moved out here, we found this building and then added on to it. That was his job, to build this.
Yeah, she's lucky to have a wife like this to let me build something like that. I mean,
Again, it got him out of the house.
Would you say it's an addiction almost?
Yes. Yes.
How did you? You kind of covered how you acquired it in various pieces. Is there anything you don't have that you wish you did? Somewhere along the way, you left it in a building that got torn down, or just
No.
fell through your fingers?
no, because if there was something in the building that I couldn't take, I would find a museum or someplace where they would take it. And some of the bigger things. And so consequently, I think I'm pretty well satisfied with the way things ended
I
up.
hope so.
Yeah, I mean, like the drum behind her there, that drum is old UP drum and bugle corps. The Union Pacific at one time had a drum and bugle corps, and so, you know, to me, you know, you won't find one of those anymore because the stuff's all gone.
Yeah, that's it.
You know, so that's why you see a drum in a railroad museum. It's part of the old Union Pacific Drum and Bugle Corps. And they had a big, you know, they'd march in the parades downtown and that, and you don't see that anymore. I mean, that camaraderie or the small community type activities aren't there, you know.
So you kind of touched upon that. That's a perfect segue to the next question, which is, why is collecting important? Why is all this important?
I think because I know it showed our kids what some of the historical things were in the prior days. I mean, today's so fast, it's so fast paced, and I don't think they take the time to realize what some of the history is. I mean, they're probably, I don't want to say they're not interested in the history, but everything's so fast-paced today that they lose track or lose sight of it. So, kind of brings them back to reality.
Yeah, definitely so. So this is a much tougher question, but if you were to narrow it down here, what is your favorite piece? Your single favorite piece? And that goes for both of you.
I have 2. I have the dinner bell,
Okay.
which they used on the dining cars to call people to come to dinner. And then I really, really like the mail, for the mail baggage car, where they brought the mail into the car and sorted it and then dropped these bags off at the different depots. Those are my 2 favorite. I don't know how he can pick a favorite.
It's
but,
a tough question, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then why don't you, a few maybe, a few
Well,
favorite pieces.
I think that China, I love the Portland Rose China, and when I found the drumhead Portland Rose, that they served that china on that train that ran from Portland. Uh, it actually came in Omaha. So that, to me, the Portland Rose was my favorite china, and the drumhead. When I found the drumhead of the old Portland Rose, why, that just made it that much better. So
That's an original piece.
yeah,
Wow. Wow. That's quite neat.
and the drumhead would be on the rear, mounted on the back of the rear car. So
It's always,
Yeah.
collecting toy trains.
yeah,
That little light glows in the dark. It's quite a
yeah,
in that rear car of a passenger car. Yeah.
Right.
Neat. I guess you've lived it. Any advice for, let's say, somebody who's just starting out in the railroad field? I've got a volunteer at the museum, for example, whose grandson-in-law is not a relatively newcomer in Union Pacific, but fairly new, and he's got a bright future ahead of him. What advice would you give somebody who's just starting out in the railroad field or wants to pursue that as a career?
their best bet's probably to try to get into some type of office work to start with, and then by doing that, they get to know the railroad a little better, and then on some of those jobs, they can go out to the field and get their field experience. I think every railroader, even in today's environment, needs both the office and field work, so they understand the complete railroad. And too many times, I always say a person gets to be like a horse with blinders, where if you just work in the office, that's all you know, and you don't realize that there's a lot of different things going on out in the field. If you get out in the field, they don't realize what's going on in the office. But by I wasn't forced, I was recommended to move around to learn all the different aspects, and that was good advice early on. And I think that I had a couple people that I mentioned, R.M. Brown from the railroad. I tell you another one that was a great admirer of mine, and I spoke to him quite often, was John Kennefick.
Oh, sure.
And he was adamant that you needed to move around and hold different positions so that you knew all aspects of the railroad. And he had done that in his career, and that was his recommendation. So it was good advice. And that's why I'd recommend any young person who wants to start out, get their foot in the door, take the first job you can get, and then it opens up the door, and you move around and learn all the aspects. And
So tell me about moving the two locomotives that you see, the gateway to Omaha. If you're coming from I-80, it's really the first thing you see when you get to Nebraska.
right, well, we decided, when they decided to move them, of course they were downtown, located downtown, and we had to move them out to the location. And in order to move them down, the only way you could move them is down the center of the street. And so we checked streets to make sure which streets were safe enough to move and without damaging sewer systems, which are all underground. And so consequently, once we got permit from the city, then we hired a contractor, and of course he jacked them up and put rubber tired wheels under them so we could, and then haul them, and we just hauled them down City Street, got them up to the park, and then of course jacked them up and put beams underneath them to slide them sideways. put big, like house moving beams. I don't know if you ever, and that's why we got a house mover, because they use the beams to move a house and slide it off the foundation and then slide it back on the foundation. And so that was ideal for us to do the same thing with the locomotives. They would put these huge beams in there with rollers on them, and then it was just an easy matter of sliding them back and forth. So consequently, that's how we moved both the locomotives. The 6936 was so heavy that we took both of the big trucks off them, the wheels.
Right.
We dropped the trucks on both ends, took them out, and then put the dolly wheels underneath and slid them. And then once we got it back in place where it belonged, then we jacked them up again and put the wheels back underneath. So,
But you and Mr. Kennefic personally walked with those locomotives up 10th Street. And when they got to Vinton, they had to remove a building so they could get those turned around the corner.
Like the angle.
Otherwise, yes, the angle for them. But they did. They personally walked them up 10th Street.
How long did that whole operation take?
well, once we started in the morning, took us almost all day to make
For one of them,
for one of them.
yes.
And I think that was one day on each of them.
Mm-hmm, yes.
So, yeah, it took all day.
I'm surprised it didn't take longer. I know that probably a lot went into the planning to make
Yeah,
it
the
happen.
planning is the biggest thing. If you do all the planning right and coordinate it with all the different agencies, like especially the police department, because they blocked off street access, and you know you have to think about ambulances. You know, how do you get an ambulance to the hospital? You know, or whatever. So consequently, there's a lot of pre-planning, and if you do your pre-planning properly, it goes very easy. So everything is in the pre-planning.
Well, it's quite a. I don't see those locomotives going anywhere. It's quite a
I
feat.
think they'll stay
Yeah.
there until, and you know they've been restored, and they've done some cosmetic work to fix parts, you know, so they don't rust out and stuff like that. So I think that they're there for as long as I'm around. I know that.
It's interesting that when you drive in, those are the first things you see, and it's just fantastic at night, especially, I think.
Yeah.
And then you see the American flag, and then right below that, it's not the state flag; it's the Union Pacific flag, which
Yeah.
Yes.
gets me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
were there
Yeah.
any projects during your career, bridge building, bridge repair, something that was, I guess each project of this size is kind of one of a kind, but I think about the miles of railroad. Some areas are very remote and dangerous,
Yeah.
and to coordinate and make that happen. Were there any others?
Well, I think, yeah, rebuilding some bridges, and the high bridge over in Iowa,
The Kate Shelley Bridge.
Kate Shelley Bridge. Yeah, there's some big projects that I'd worked on over the years, and with a lot of other people, involved. But yeah, it's like I said, it's been an interesting career, and I don't think, in today's environment, I know my boys, the one who works for the railroad, I don't think he'll see the things that I saw. I mean, they'll see different things, different problems, different challenges, but the heavy lifting of some of this equipment is, they don't make it, they make lightweight stuff now. They don't make this heavyweight locomotives like they made. So consequently, you're not going to experience the same problems. So.
Has there been anything I should ask, or anything I've left out? Anything you want to talk more about?
Well, I can't. You think of anything? But
No,
You,
no.
I can see you smiling.
I'm just smiling. You've had a very successful career and a lot to be proud of. And this
Very
museum,
supportive wife. That's the thing.
Thanks to Bill and Judy Wimmer and the Wimmer family for working with us and allowing us to sit down and chat about their family history. We look forward to keep working together to tell the history of the railroad and Sarpy County.